Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Marianne, and I'm the general manager here at City Bookshop, an independent, community-minded, and woman-owned bookstore here on Capitol Hill. Can I ask who's been here before? Amazing. Love to see so many hands. And who's here for the first time? Welcome. And for anyone joining us online for the first time or coming back, thank you for being here as well. We're so glad that you all braved the cold or are snuggled up at home in your pajamas to watch tonight. We are here to celebrate the Starseekers, a brand new standalone historical fantasy set in the world of the Conductors, in which the space race of the mid 20th century will be determined by magic, if not murder. Very exciting. If you're here tonight, be sure to check out our other upcoming events and book clubs. Next on our calendar are an event for Jazz June by Clifford Thompson, which is tomorrow night at the Hill Center, just a couple of blocks away. Next week on Wednesday, we have an event for Let the People Hear It, 100 Years of Concerts at the Library of Congress. So nice local interest. Hope you can join us for one of those events, one of our 14 book clubs, or any other events coming up that might strike your interest. You can find more information about everything coming up on our website, eastcitybookshop.com. Before I introduce our authors, some very quick housekeeping notes. If you could take a moment to silence your cell phones, we'll all appreciate it. If anyone needs a restroom, they are located upstairs, right past the cash register. While you're near the cash register, you may as well buy a copy of The Starseekers or any other book by Nicole Glover or Leslye Penelope. And tonight, the format will be we'll have a discussion between those two authors, followed by Q&A, followed by a signing line. Feel free to ask questions in person by raising your hand during the Q&A segment. If you're joining us online, you can use Zoom's Q&A feature to submit questions that we can answer as well. So, without more ado, I am so excited to introduce tonight's authors. Our author of the evening is Nicole Glover, who is the author of The Conductors and The Undertakers, as well as The Improvisers in the Murder and Magic series. When she's not writing, she's working as a UX researcher in Virginia, where her knowledge about murder and other mysteries is surprisingly useful. Joining us in conversation is Leslye Penelope, who has been writing since she could hold a pen and loves getting lost in the worlds in her head. Equally left and right-brained, she studied filmmaking and computer science at Howard University and sometimes dreams in HTML. She hosts the My Imaginary Friends podcast, co-hosts the Ink and Magic podcast, and lives in Maryland with her feline dependents. Please join me in giving our authors a warm welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm Leslye. This is Nicole.
Hi.
And we are here to talk about the Starseekers. So I have had the pleasure of talking to Nicole about several of her books as they come out. I love them all. But I don't know that I have asked you how you started writing. Like when did you start writing? Where did it begin?
Oh yeah, I started writing because I love a good story from books. I'd spent a lot of time playing dolls with my sister. We had Barbie dolls. I had doing the whole soap opera thing in our rooms. And so I liked telling stories. And also because I grew up with my grandparents were teachers. So my grandma was an English teacher. She taught me how to read and write. And somehow, I guess at one point she gave me a pen and paper. And that's where it basically began. My dad gave me a computer because basically my first computer kind of to do stuff with, basically. I started writing stories. Actually, my first stories were actually little mystery stories. I was very inspired by all the little babysitter clubs, the Goosebumps, and things like that. So it was like really short chapters. I think the first, like, it was like one-page chapters with computers and stuff like that. I had I had clip art at the bottom of the pages. I had these really creative titles for each chapters and things like that. I think most of the characters were like drawn from like classmates and stuff like that. Literally their names were in the books. Those are the first stories, and from there, just as more different things, especially all the different fantasy books I got into, I started like thinking, oh, I really like fantasy. This is the thing I really wanted to do more about and read about and write about, and kind of even like bring more like people like me, like my characters, people like more shyer characters who going on adventures, doing fun things, and the thing with like the conductors and all these other books came about because I'm interested in history as well. I grew up most of my life in Virginia, so if you're in Virginia, you can throw a stone, you hit something historical. And so I grew up all on my field trips for like history, and I got really interested in not just the history stuff, but stuff you don't really learn about in history classes. Then you kind of got to really dig deep about these certain things. And and that kind of with all those interested led me into writing stuff and kind of keep exploring and learning more about these things. 'Cause I think writing is some ways to kind of get all the thoughts in my head, things I'm interested in, and get out on the page. And so I always say like writing's like my big hobby, my favorite hobby. Even now, it's still my biggest hobby. Like, forget TV. Well, 'cause I watch TV and movies and all those video games, stuff like that. But, wouldn't know what to do if I can't write each night. And the days when I have to I take my break as soon as I finish a draft, I got to give myself a break to fill the well. I don't know what to do with myself when I don't have to write. When I force myself not to write, I don't know what to do that evening. Sometimes I actually go to bed early because I don't know what else to do.
Yeah, we have a lot of the same, like we both work in tech. We were
Yeah.
on a panel a couple of years ago with another author,
Yeah.
Veronica G. Henry, about like
Mhm.
Black fantasy and sci-fi writers who
Yes.
work in tech. My grandparents were also teachers. My
Yes.
grandfather was a college professor, and my grandmother was a teacher. My mom was a teacher. She taught me to read when I was super
Hmm.
young, and like I'm older than you, so I was like typing on a typewriter my first stories. Like I had this like
A smart
typewriter with,
story.
yeah, like I still have a bunch, like a whole stack of like typewritten
Oh
pages of
my
my
goodness.
first stories. And then my dad got me a computer. So yeah, like very parallel paths
Hmm.
in terms of that. So okay, the world of the Starseekers, which is the
Hmm.
same world as your other three
Yes.
books, same family.
Hmm.
Tell us a little bit about the Starseekers. What is it about and what inspired it?
The Starseekers got inspired because a little movie called Hidden Figures came out just as I was hunting around what to set my 1960s stories in. Because I think originally it was going to be Motown. Because you think 60s, think Motown. It's like the main character originally going to be like, she was like in high school, she was in like a little girls group, kind of like the Supremes, Marvelettes, all those different groups like that. But the Hidden Figures came out, I was like, I always loved NASA and astrology, and this is like, it's funny, even though as I've did the research, there's been a lot of research about all these characters, these people, these computers at NASA, but we didn't really get to know about it until the movie and the books really came out. And so I got really lucky because the movie came out, because the book came out, it was like big, everyone was talking about it. Opened up the gates for all the research. So it made it really easy for me to find not just about Katherine Johnson and all the other people highlighted in the films, but also people you don't really hear about as well. So I was really got to, because people wanted to just all these other people you don't hear about, like Yvette Young and some other engineers at the time. There's like I got be able to I had a bounty of things to look for. And originally Star Seekers wasn't really part of like my little universe series. I was kind of creating it. I had this an idea that it was mostly more of a standalone thing. But with the conductors coming out, Undertakers, basically started the universe, brought the magic in there, and it kind of goes through the trends between different publishers I was working with. My editors are interesting like that because it loves my first books and they're like, what we'd like to see more of that world, but what different characters. So I kind of came to them. Here's some ideas for things I had in the backlog of things I'm interested in. So that's how Starkeeters kind of came out, and I had to it wasn't too hard to fit it into the world because. I love fantasy. I always had a little bit of magic weaved into it. I think the really early versions of the book had like a different kind of magic system that's kind of similar to what it came into be because I had written the Star Seekers. Think the first draft was I think it's about 10 years now that it's gone through the different versions of things because the very first draft is much different than what came out in the final. Even though the only three things staying the same: Cynthia, Theo, and her cat Dot. Those are the only things that really stay the same. So I think it's really funny. I think I look back of how much it's changed, and what really stays the same, and the little changes I added to it really made the book sing. Like adding the sisters to the book as having younger sisters. 'Cause I think in the original draft she didn't have younger sisters, and adding that opened up how I built the story and just thinking about this bringing updating the world with magic from how the conductors was to what it could be more of a modern setting was really fascinating to me because with a lot of fantasy it's always like back in historical times, you don't really it doesn't really melt the tech. And with improvisers as well and Star Seekers allowed me to see what the world would look like if you added some magic to it and how you kind of blend it and make it work with technology and kind of make it a way that's not like it's fighting against it, not the way that's like technology doesn't kill the magic, but kind of amplifies it. And it's really fun for me figuring out ways to kind of bring magic into the NASA settings. I got nerded out a bit about how I could make, the magical fuel or things that could amplify like the NASA projects, because I think a lot of the research that Cynthia does in the book is kind of related to like the Apollo project, but the ways to kind of enhance it, have magical alternates to it. And that was really fun for me, finding a way to blend the real world aspect of things, make the magic make sense for things, and just make it so that when readers read it, I'm just not just making up stuff that seems silliness. I'm just adding, stacking on the magic. It makes sense. It flows really well. So all that was kind of just fun to build into this particular book.
Yeah, so the world of this book, in the conductors were like introduced to the magic system, where
Mm,
at that time it was in the
mm,
1870s, like Black people practiced a different kind of magic to white
mm,
people, and in that like 100 years prior, in that world, like Black people weren't allowed to use wands, and so you've progressed over the course of four books
yes,
as the decades have passed. Like
yes.
magic has grown, and as like social changes have happened, magic has
Hmm.
changed. So can you talk a little bit about like the actual magic system
Hmm.
and the changes that you saw over time as you were creating
Hmm.
these different books?
Yeah, the magic system kind of remains the same. The main characters still practice celestial magic, which is basically the constellation. They kind of draw them, and they get more creative with how that's incorporated to things. Cynthia uses like the cards, basically, kind of draw the star sigils and stuff onto them. But around her, like I started bringing in other characters who are doing different kind of magic systems as well. Her best friend in the book, Mavis, is a wand user, which is a change because originally in the conductors, like they were banned for using wands, but I kind of hint throughout the books that there's wand acts that make it more allowed for people to get wands and whatnot. So I kind of mentioned the things that she's using, and I think there's even like a little dialogue that's them going back and forth saying, "Oh, there's like there's styles where people kind of incorporate the celestial magic with wands, like they're basically kind of just using the wands to draw the constellations as well." And it's kind of hints of how the world shifts around the different attitudes and things as well. Um, and also the potion side, it doesn't really get as much focus in here as much, but I do like mention a lot of the herbal plants and the enchanted plants and things like that. And I always like that note of the natural aspect of things, and it's just it's because in the involving of the magic system. It's always thinking about how it's will be different in this particular book, how it's going to say something different. And even though it doesn't always come to the forefront of things, it informs how I'm like having the characters move around, how magic they're doing, and even like the smaller things they're how they're all the magic antics of how they well, the mystery solving side of things or the things they get into. Seeing how they incorporate that magic in there is kind of fun for me to find a different twist on things, do something a little bit different. Because even though it's the same system, it's each book has a different twist on how I incorporate magic and try to do something different that I hadn't done before. And I also like bring in more broom writing in this particular book as well, because Cynthia writes a broom, typical witch stuff. But it's fun for me to actually really incorporate how her broom farming differently throughout the book, whether it's just her trying to get to places on time, speeding past really quickly, or just having us using it to like snoop around, track people, all those other fun stuff, using it, getting different levels of things. So it's kind of fun as being dynamic with that and having that part of her personality, and also showing a different side of personality as well. So I also feel like a lot of times how people use magic shows a lot of how they are as a person, whether they get big and flamboyant or get very messy about it. I think I mentioned like her cousin in the book is like he's very lazy with his magic, even though he's very good at it. He's very lazy at how he draws his sigils. So it's actually a point that she points out fairly in the book that she gets alarmed with seeing it's very neat. And there's a reason for that as you find as you read through it. So just bring all that stuff in there. It's kind of fun for me. It's a different personality, different aspects of things as well.
So in the book, the main character is Cynthia Rhodes, and if you have read the Undertakers, the Conductors, and the Improvisers, there are other characters that have appeared. Although this is a standalone, so if you have
Mhm.
not read any of those, although I think you should, you'll be okay reading this one. So Cynthia works at NASA, and she is a descendant of, comes from this mystery solving family that we've read about before. And there is a mystery that comes upon her. She's kind of hung up her mystery solving
Mhm.
for reasons,
Yeah.
but of course, she gets drawn back in.
Mhm.
And she's also a co-host of an educational TV show that teaches kids about magic.
Yes.
And so it's kind of like a magical Black Mr. Rogers. Like, tell us about
Yeah.
the TV show a little bit.
Oh yes, I got really interested because Sesame Street came out with a big anniversary, one of their like 50th anniversary a few years ago. So I got all the articles about it came up, and I got really interested in the fact they talked about the Black history of Sesame Street. There was like a Black psychologist who was very involved in the making and the design of things. Sesame itself is kind of is a reaction to the civil rights movement. Is the creators and the producers, creators behind it were like they wanted to make sure that the Black kids, mainly inner city kids, are how be able to access education. But there was a very Black presence behind the scenes, and you even see that with the opening episodes where they have the main adult characters are a Black couple basically, and even just being in the city. So it's really fascinating. Not real life, because I didn't really watch Sesame Street as often because I guess apparently my parents didn't turn to that channel a lot. But I got interested in how the building of that, behind the scenes, even just learning about the evolution of children's education on television from the 50s and 60s and onwards. And so that was really fun for me. It's something I just want to include into the book. And so I was like, how do I include this in here? And I was also thinking of it'd be fun, like as her like a little side thing that she does educational stuff into this TV show. And so as close to my spin of course, it's a magical education. Because I was thinking because I was thinking alongside of it would be a fun way to kind of show how people learning educational how people learning magic and how it could be against, especially against the idea of the 1960s as well, given like the different education, the segregation within schools and stuff like that. It's a good counterpoint and also ties into some of the smaller subplots within the book involving her younger sisters who are going through some educational woes at the same time. So it's a nice little parallel thing. But the educational television aspect of the thing was for me to kind of just weave different things I'm interested in as well, but emphasize it's a really fun way of how people could learn magic of education as well. And I think it also kind of brought in some also got because I also at the same time was interested in the Black presence of Black TV stations. Because I think there was a few stations in actually in DC and Philadelphia that I took inspiration from. They were like there was kind of Black owned channels that had DJs, and then they had like dance shows and just different channels that was like for us by us mentality. So I kind of bring that in there. But the magical education stuff was really fun. And actually the title of the show, What's My Spell, was actually it's a riff off of What's My Line from like a 1950s show. It was actually another illusion because my favorite movie growing up was 101 Dalmatians. And they had that What's My Crime thing in the segment. So it's like, oh, which was a riff of the What's My Line as well. So it's like that's my little nod and allusion to that as well.
Yeah, it's really cool to like writing historical and finding cool things and wanting to put them in because
Yeah.
you just kind of sometimes you go down rabbit holes and
Yeah.
you're like everybody needs to know about this or you're just inspired by
Yeah.
something. So writing about the 60s, that's a time period like I've written 1920s and
Hmm.
1930s and I've had ideas for the 60s, but anytime you're dealing with Black
Yes.
history, it can be, and we were kind of talking about this, there's this tension about, when you're writing Black history, especially fantasy, it's like there's so many dark things in
Hmm.
Black history, and we're not your books are very like they're not dark at all.
Hmm.
They're murder mysteries, but they're
Right.
still fun
Yes.
and like they're relatively light. Um, so dealing with the 60s, you don't shy away from
Hmm.
talking about, the movements and the revolutionaries. And even in the very beginning, there's like some of the other books, you start with news articles and
Hmm.
there's an article about some protests and they mention that. And so can you talk about like writing in the 60s where there's a
Hmm.
period of, social unrest and Black liberation and
Hmm.
all of that, and doing it in a way that is still true to your tone and your
Hmm.
style and still kind of giving us a light book that is relevant and like
Hmm.
rooted in Black culture and history.
Yeah, to come into any of the books, I know coming in this is what's going to happen. I can't like not mention it because people, yeah, that's what they kind of know. Sometimes that's what all they know about certain time periods. So I want to find a way I allude to it, I reference it, but it's not the main plot. That's my thing. It's discrimination, yeah. All that's racial tensions, yeah, it's there, but it's not the main plot. It's not gonna drive any of the mystery stuff or even like the personal stuff, but it's there as kind of window dressing part of this basic setting the scene for things. And I'd try to find ways where it to make sense. I think in the Star Seekers particularly I mentioned like the magical civil rights groups and that called Wander, which I kind of literally made that acronym up just because I like the name for it. I don't really know what it actually means. That's the acronym, but it's my illusion for a civil rights group at the time, magical civil rights group at the time. I mentioned that a leader in particular had gotten like recently assassinated sort of referencing kind of other like mega adverts in particular of things like that, and just mentioning, or even like they go to like a restaurant within the book, and then they just mention this is like a place, like a hub for like activists coming in and things like that, and like even some of the family members are involved in there. I think she had some cousins that are actually card carrying communists that you don't see in the book, but even though her grandparents actually get called up before like communist trials and things like that as well. And because that's because her grandparents were artists and who did like a famous infamous painting in the world where that's basically it's like a protest painting basically. And because artists are always saying things that make people upset. So I kind of that's how I kind of weave these things in there, but as a backdrop to kind of form the characters, inform what's going on, form where the character's coming from, and to add flavor and texture to the world. And not try to like belittle the actual history as well, but by doing certain things, but just mentioning these things as well. And like my opening sections where I mentioned like these little articles that said the drive-in thing with the World's Fair was actually a real thing. It's actually kind of just I only just added in the only thing that's like fictional is like the magical aspect of things. But they actually did have like protests when the World's Fair was coming to New York at that time.
Are there any other like really cool research things that you
Mm,
found that maybe didn't fit into the book that you wished, or
mm.
that just like stuck out to you?
Oh, so many things. It's like I can cut like a lot of the Motown stuff got cut a lot. I think I had a like going to different theaters and things like that. That's a lot of that got cut out the way because there was no more section for that as well. I even made Cynthia know because basically not know anything popular about music because that was my illusion to things like that. Let's see what else got cut. I think that was kind of the major thing. I guess some trying to think of anything else. I don't think anything major, anything particularly major. I think I got really good at figuring out what I need to keep on subject for page things. Because one thing I got really bad at, because I always get really interested in so many things, trying to cram so many things into the book. So I think I got really good at figuring out what's is key to have in here to make makes most sense. And so sometimes it's just like extra details and just also just refining certain things or just trying to make sure it makes sense to the setting. I think there's a lot of NASA stuff that like just testing things like that. That wasn't really it doesn't even though it's a fictional NASA place research center at it didn't really make sense to have there anymore. So I think I end up cutting that. I think they had this whole greenhouse thing where they're growing plants because I got really fascinated about the growing food for space and space missions things like that. So I think I had like they're using magic, so they're using like these enchanted plants for the greenhouse and thing like that. I ended up just cutting a whole section related to that because it didn't really quite fit for what I was really doing, and it's just even though it was interesting to me, it just didn't. It was too much of a side quest and stuff. I think that's also because I ended up changing roles of particular characters. I think I had one of her cousins actually I got maybe not her boss, but like her manager or something like that. I ended up changing her role entirely, and I ended up cutting a lot of that stuff out as well. And it's a lot of that particular research or things like that.
So you're talking about research. NASA, the version of NASA that you have,
Yeah.
it's filled with Cynthia's an arcane engineer,
Yes.
right? And they have other, magical engineers and
Mm,
alchemists are
yes.
part of NASA. But it does also seem very grounded. Like how much research did you do into real NASA in the 60s? And then knowing you were adding magic to
Mm,
it, like how did you approach that?
yeah.
Because it can be like do all this research and make it as real as possible, and then the magic is just replacing
Mm,
certain like real
yeah.
technical things, or like how did you approach
It
it?
was a mix of things. I'd pulled a lot of resources from anything that looks like the entire Apollo mission stuff. I think I found a really good book was like How We Got to the Moon. I think it's more of like a children's nonfiction, but it had like a really good different topics, like a lot of inspiration from. I actually found like the manual for like because it's the Ainsworth Research Center that the fictional version actually based off Goddard up in Maryland. So I've actually found like a book that came out I guess pretty early when the research center was built that basically here's the history of the lab, how it was built and who was first there and like all those other things and even like maps of the campus I actually kind of use a little bit in the book and so that was a really great resource for me to help me visualize what it's like, what kind of roles are doing, and figuring out what makes sense for these people, what makes sense for what people will actually be doing. And yeah, of course, all the research into different like the engineers and chemists and background people, behind the scenes people that just I want to take inspiration. When I always research historical people, I always like I don't put the person in the book. I just take certain aspects I like that's interesting or that I can include. And, I actually did read some like mathematical books about NASA stuff, engineering stuff. I can't remember too much about it. Don't ask me about any of these things, but just getting a sense of what they may be looking at, what they're looking at, what they might be doing. Because even though I do all this research, it's just less than 10%, maybe even 5%, and it ends up on the page. It's for me to feel comfortable about the world, to make sure I'm making sense and it feels real enough. I can't say like the project they're doing, the process, even that the fun names I gave the project they're doing. So I think I call myself like Project Hummingbird and like Deep Dive and things like that. It's fun names I gave. I can't say it's particularly accurate for that even that time period, but it's something it feels like it makes sense. It feels real and this feels like it doesn't stick out to people that has at least a basic level of knowledge, which is always a challenge with historical fiction no matter if it's fantasy or this realistic world. You have to do enough research, enough include enough historical facts to make it makes seems it makes sense. Because I always say like it's the big things you can't like mess around with. You can't say so and so lost this particular war without a good reason. Because people it'll stick out. But sometimes you can get away with the smaller stuff so that only like the hardcore people will really know about stuff. That they might email you kind of angry that you got this wrong, or you added a river or a street, or this wasn't right, and certain stuff.
Yeah, you definitely get those emails. But yeah, the world feels really rich and like I think that we kind of approach research in a similar way so that
Mm-hmm.
like you it's not there, it's not on the page, but it
Mm-hmm.
feels like it infuses the page so that when you're reading it, it's like it's a real world, it's a real place, and you do a really good job with the world building. So about the plot, I wanted to ask you about, I'm imagining you had this huge murder board on your wall because this is probably the twistiest book of yours. I'm like, every time I listen to the whole thing and I'm just like, wait, what? And there's twists, like another twist and then another thing. Like, how did you make this puzzle? It's definitely puzzlier than I think your other
Yeah.
books.
Yeah, I wanted to make it more like Twister because the character is very smart, which is a challenge to write really smart people. That's probably why like with Sherlock Holmes, Watson's the main character, the main point of view character because it's easier to, make things really realistic from his point of view instead of Sherlock because you have to be really smart. And the author has to pretend to be smarter than the character. So I think I guess I purposely made some twists and turns because some ways I could also my view with sometimes with mysteries, I guess more modern mysteries these days. It's not really just who did it, but maybe it's like the how and particularly why. Because I think because we had so many mysteries, for instance, the Golden Ages, like it's so-called Golden Ages mysteries that we are used to some tropes and trends, and so like it's more of like kind of not just reimagining mystery, but making a mystery way it's more engaging, make it more about the journey sometimes. And so for me, just taking the character on the journey about this mystery was really fun for me, just to see like maybe it's this or this is this particular dead body or this might be a particular reason or how it opens up and changes a bit and how it evolves with the overall arching things. I did not have a mortar board though. I'm the person that had like a notebooks of like scribbled notes all over the place and just different Word docs. And I think it's something as I go through different passages of the book, I just see like, oh, there's a note. Maybe I could like amp this up here or this particular twist or this would be kind of fun to add this particular here, make this particular twist and turn for me. And it's one of those things that just it makes more sense in my head it's the thing about funny for me about writing is that it's writing helps me like get all my thoughts together on the page. And as I go through the book, I see more things, and sometimes realize I set things up like the third or second draft that I only realize I meant it near like the fifth or sixth draft because that's how my brain works sometimes. But yeah, I think that just notes and just characters, and it's kind of knowing like I think because I go into mysteries, kind of knowing who did it, why, for the most part, it allows me to kind of play around with the forms and this take the journey, make that journey more interesting for the characters.
Cool, yeah. So for your process, are you like what is your process? Are you do write the first draft all the way through, or do you like iterate each chapter and make it perfect and then move on to the next one?
Yeah, I'm the type to try to do the first draft and let go. The ending is maybe like outlines, like it sounds like here's the end. It's in like things I'll come back to because I fleshed out the ending point. But be very sequential. I go back. I just go from A to A from page one to the end and go back in different cycles that way. And sometimes I know if a certain scene needs more work, I might go back between a certain section where it's midway or the first third or so. And I usually get a sense of like what's not working. It might be go that way and kind of go from there until I feel pretty good about it. I feel as I go through different drafts, I get when I get to the kicking tire phase, when I'm just basically looking to see if there's something wrong with it, and when I start getting really like picky about this certain sentence structure, I know the draft's pretty good. So that's when I can move on to like making sure it's polished and amping up some things. But I find like my first drafts are basically like really fleshed out brainstorms of really fleshed out outlines, and I go back. I know like my one of my first drafts will like, be like 70,000 words. And I know I'll easily add, 15, 20 just by doing a second pass. And each pass I'll add extra words. And it's sometimes a bad habit because and I guess because as you flesh things out, you add things, you add certain scenes, you find connective tissue scenes that you didn't realize you needed at first drop, and now you know you need it. Or you want to add amp up like, the romance plot because I have a nice little romance a subplot goes through the book as well. So there are certain things you add to certain scenes. And so it's a very like an organic way of this. The book just reveals itself like a marble, taking take with a marble, with a sculpture, you chipping away until it fully form. And even though I start every book with like a basic idea. I'm still kind of surprised when I finish it how it turns out because that's to me that's the beauty of like the writing how it just unfolds and I discover certain things I didn't really expect and kind of looking back even at like the very first draft and or more recent drafts and like oh how much it has changed and it's always kind of delightful for me.
I do want to ask you about the romance. I want
Mhm.
y'all to get your questions ready. We're going to break for questions in a few minutes, but I write romance and
Yes.
I also always have a love story in my books that are not
Yeah.
romance. And so you've always had like a bit of a
Yeah.
love story in your books, but this one is the most romance on
Yes.
like of any of the books. And I was
Yes.
like, ooh, I was like super excited because like with the first one, I loved Hetty and I loved Benji and like it was like a trickle. It was like, okay, there's something there. It was enough
Mhm.
for me as a romance lover to be like, but it was tiny.
Yeah.
And I think in each book you've gotten a little bit more.
Yeah.
So if you like romance, Starseekers has a little bit more than the other ones. How
Mhm.
did that, was that just like the feeling of the
Mhm.
characters, or have you just been reading more romance? Like what's going on?
I guess it's a mix of everything. It's a mix of how the characters are involved. There's also a mix of me wanting to do romance different in each book. Like, I had married couple in the first two books, improvised. It was kind of like a rivals to lover situation. And this one is more like you get a sense that there's an attraction there, there's a vibe going on. And there's also character types. So like there's not going to like they're not going to dance around it too much so it's like so it allows me to have fun with that idea so you get to see some of the first within the first they have as the couple but also involves more directly with the mystery as well because I kind of tied some of the mystery high points with the romance as well like they go like their first date is tied to the first big investigation thing they're doing and things like that so it's like they start getting it get more obvious what they're interested in by getting into solving the mystery in the first place. That was also fun, and I think it's also me is getting more comfortable adding that romantic thread in there. Maybe I was reading a romance book that kind of got me more inspired to do certain things, but it felt right for the characters, I think. And 'cause I've always feel like it's no matter what dynamics I have with the characters within the books, it's always what the characters maybe not telling me or it just feels like it works really well with them. And I just felt like they're the type of characters they want to have romance with alongside the adventures they're doing because they're all about the high points, the high stakes, the high adventures, the excitement. So it really works really well with them. And I think also just having it just is having it there's a dynamic of the history where they kind of just grow together as well. It's really fun for me.
Yeah, that was cool. Like as you read it, you realize this has been like building for a long time and so
Mhm.
it was very fun. All right, y'all, do you have any questions in the audience or online? Yes.
Yes. Yes. Mhm. Mhm.
So let me repeat the question for people online. How did you stay motivated over the 10
Mhm.
years that it took to write this book?
Well, it helped I published three other books along the way. Because yeah, because it's mostly they had that big gap. Because I that's when I got the conductors pretty much. I mean, a couple years after I started writing this, I got to actually put the Starseekers down. And I guess technically this final version of this book is it took less it I took less time. It didn't take 10 years. It was like maybe like less than a year to put together really with all the drafts and things like that. But anything, but it's still an idea I wanted to go to when my editor said wanted to or pitch or asking for pitches and stuff like that. It's an idea I felt really strongly about. I really love this idea, love this world, this particular character, this kind of vibe in the 1960s and all this magical stuff. So I was like, it's always fine with this an idea that I really love. I keep thinking about. It's always in the back of my mind. It's always on my list of story ideas to write. That kind of keeps me motivated, and also knowing that as over the time I evolve as a writer. Like maybe if I wrote this book this version is I'm not as the writer I was back then. And sometimes I feel like sometimes you have an idea that you're not the right person to write at a particular time, but give yourself a year, even a month, or maybe 5 years. You're a better place in your life because of things you experience, things you learned, just other books you read. That's just all the other influences gonna just help you become a better, help you write the book you've been thinking about.
Yeah, some books take a long time to cook, I think.
Yes.
You had a question? Reader, I didn't know this wasn't a romance book when I started, I got eating it up. I was like, oh, when did they kiss? This is so good. Like, because I read this one first and it's set in the 60s, and then your other books are set like earlier in
Mhm.
like where do you feel like historical romance kind of stops, or as you build up this world, like is the
Mm.
80s too modern and like so it's not history anymore, so you can't go past the 80s, or do you have to go like back into the 40s and like a different
Mhm.
for character? Like how do you like play around in the timeline as it gets like I don't like I think about historical romance as like the 18s,
Mm.
1920s. Start getting into like my parents and
Mm.
grandparents like, less. So I wonder if you think about the questions about how do you think about historical romance and
Mhm.
what is historical?
Well, I mean, that goes back to like the what's historical. I think there is a definition that it's 25 years in the past. So 2000, that's historical fiction, baby.
I have a book coming out in it's set in 1999, and I refuse to believe that it's historical
Yeah,
fiction.
that's the definition. But
Technically,
yeah,
yeah,
technically,
like,
but
according to the publishers.
mhm. But I guess over a long time, like historical romance, it's been like the Bridgerton era, the Regency England time period, and I think anything around 1920 gets too modern because that's mostly because 1920s is like the first modern decade. Because I always say if you want to write historical fiction and you're not too used to writing historical, 1920 is a good place to start because that's when you have cars, you have telephones, you have radio. I think TV, all that stuff. It's things that's very familiar, even though it's still distant, but a lot of things are still familiar. But you don't have those things when you go to even back to 1890s and things like that. So that's it's how we view historical. And actually, that's very thing that's really fascinating to me because I remember reading that with Sherlock Holmes movies started coming being adapted. They used to be set in like kind of modern day. When they first started, kind of 1900s stuff like that. They were still the movies were still like current. But I think it got into like maybe the 1940s. That's when they started making them historical. They started actually setting them in the Victorian era. And so it comes to our point of view, like what we view as historical. So that's why when we talk about historical, we don't really think, the 80s and 90s because we have still its living history. We have our parents, our grandparents, our cousins, even some of us, we remember these decades and time periods. So it doesn't feel historical. So it's like it's a great perception of what it is and like it's been always been the definition. So it's even though, it's how you view certain things. And that's for me writing certain stuff. I guess I actually did write for this particular series, I had like a draft tucked away somewhere. Like I went as far into the 1980s and in modern day actually. And maybe because I was doing those drafts like behind everything else, those two weren't as fun for me a bit. Maybe because it wasn't just, I guess because it felt too close to modernness. And especially the modern one. It wasn't as fun anymore, I guess. But maybe I was burned out from just writing these different drafts. Because I think I did because way back when I did the Starseekers, I did like other drafts set in like of this kind of world, was playing with the 1920s, 1940s, and 1980s, and I did these like back to back. So probably by the time I got to that, I was kind of just done with historical stuff. But it's just all about perception, and if you want to dive into, I think we should have more like more modern day later stuff like the 70s, like 60s, 80s, and things like that because there are things because it's living history, we don't really think about the things we overlooking that's we could kind of accumulate and highlight. 'Cause I think there was a Netflix show a few years ago, like The Get Down, that came out years ago, and like I really loved like seeing the 1970s, and even though I'm thinking this is a time where my parents were like teenagers and stuff like that as well, but it got to highlight things I didn't really think about historical wise because that's just too recent, but we don't really think about it that way. So I think exploring different decades of time through fiction is a good way to kind of explore and think about these things and highlight things we might have overlooked, even though we think we can still find it, even though it's all recorded elsewhere. Mm. Yes. Mhm. Mhm.
The question is about celestial magic and how you settled on it and drawing the
Yeah.
sigils.
Well, the big reason I did it, because when you make a magic system, it's always something you really like. So I love astrology, you can tell. I've always been a big fan of that. But as I found, it's stars is like a very natural magic. And I was thinking, like, especially with the conductors, is because the background of that thing is like it was kind of really is built on the plantations where they had been torn away. They had to basically remake a magic system, and the stars are there. And it really ties to a lot of the research. We all know the North Star and people using stars to guide things. It felt like it fit really well. But the visualist aspect of like the constellations kind of coming to life. I have in the book the different constellation, the zodiac or Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, all those the little dogs, the Canis Minor, all these different things kind of come to life actively, and they can be used as different things. I love the visual aspect of things. I'm a visual person, and so that's the idea of them just being interactive things, be able to draw things out, be able to either sew these things or draw on cards or add jewelry or things like that. Or it is a way to like make that magic kind of craft light. But I think a lot of the magic is kind of I would say like even all the different magic systems in the book, it's all kind of like craft. Like it's more of acting, interacting with the real world, kind of mishing you adding magical energy into the actual object or things you're interacting with, which I guess makes sense to me as a magic system instead of like something that's just coming out of the ether from nowhere. It has to be tied to the physical. Mm.
Do you fear negative feedback when you change historical details?
Um, I try to change too many major things. It's more like just worry that things I might have like fudged a little bit. Like I think I introduced bicycles earlier in the conductors than they should have been. Maybe about 5 years earlier than they were technically because I love bicycles. As anyone knows, so I just added them in there earlier on. No one really said anything to me about that. There's someone I did add like I think an actual train line between Camden and Philadelphia that someone actually did say that not doesn't exist, but I was like, this world with magic. I think there's a leeway with having a magic in the world that I can say, oh, this is slightly different. And especially going to Starseekers, where I really lean into more alternate history. Because I literally opened the book saying we have a black astronaut that's actually going into space because it's particular this program. And I use that as as the leeway of saying I can mix things up a bit. And I figure as long as I have my hard line of major things, I'm not going to change too much. But some little things I can twist and turn and just kind of go with it. Yes. Mm. Yes. Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
The question, have you thought about changing history using magic in a major way?
I think not particularly this series. I think I have offshoots of other different series that I would want to go more alternate history with. So I think when I came into this one, I wanted to have I've set an historical period on purpose, so I didn't want to change too many major things. But because I've been writing these things and writing other research, I'm like I have other alternate history ideas. Because the one like plot bunny I had for a while now was when I learned that Abraham Lincoln had another vice president. His vice president the first term was it was like he had a different vice president in the first term that got changed just before he got assassinated. And I think he was a little bit more pro-union. He might have like not tanked Reconstruction like Andrew Johnson had did. And so I kept thinking my alternate history idea was like, it's like that change didn't happen. We had like a more, I guess, kind of progressive it's president at that particular time. Like, what would the world look like? And I think I started like, more steampunk. We probably have airships and like the U.S. would look different and things like that. So it's that's like a that's an idea I had for a while. It's something it got me more interested as I'd done the research, thinking, oh, it's kind of this time to just change things up a bit. I just thinking, especially like now since we're like it's the new American Revolution like big celebration this year as well. It's like, oh, what does it look like if we change things differently and all these different stuff like that. So I have like a lot of different plot bunnies that kind of came out of doing all this research, like just going diving deep in these research, seeing all the different turning points of history and like kind of exploring these things. It probably wouldn't quite fit what I'm doing with this particular series, but it's great for some other ideas I have mulling over for different books. Mm.
How did you decide whether self-publishing or
Mm.
traditional publishing?
Yeah, from a kid, I always wanted my book on the library shelf. So traditional publish is the easiest way to go in that direction. So it's That's, I mean, that's how the system's set up. So it basically, it's even though it was a whole process, getting agent, getting editors, going through series of rejections, series of wows. The Conductors was, I think the fourth or fifth book I've actually pitched to an agent before it got picked up, and I think it was actually almost put the Conductors in a shelf somewhere before the agent had contacted. So I want to see more of it, and it's just. It's there's with any path, it's always the same. Whatever path you want to take, it's more of like what goals you want, what things you're interested in doing, and that's how you pick what path you want to go forward with. So I personally chose traditional publishing because I wanted to be in the library, I wanted access. I wanted my mom to basically say, "Oh, I can find it anywhere," not make it not too hard for her to find the book. Mhm, mhm,
I had a question about you talk about PBS. It makes me think about Corporation for Public
yeah.
Broadcasting and the availability, like the need for
Mm-hmm.
PBS versus potentially like private corporations or
Hmm.
like folks who are able to fund education for their children.
Hmm.
So like, how did you? Just a general question about how you thought about public versus private corporations or the economy and education in the story when you
Hmm.
were designing the world.
The question about how you thought of public versus private corporations and education.
Not too deeply, honestly. But I did look a lot into how the Sesame Street Workshop, or at least that's how it's now known as Sesame Workshop, how they brought in different people from the community, educators and things like that. I got really fascinated how they got brought in and how the I did a lot of research into how like the that was really actually was interested in how like how it even came about because there were like station studios that were doing things that's because the PBS what we know is now is known as PBS kind of came to life at this particular time as well. So learning how that happened and how people got airtime for different things like that was really fascinating to learn and build about. But as I don't as in the but otherwise of like how it's education and magic in general for the book. I think it's most I kind of really touched about it's more of like the kind of the family traditions that is passed along through the books. I kind of hinted that the a lot of the magical education was kind of within the families, and now it got shifted towards the school. Now you see some things that shift around, which makes things different or complicated, but nothing I go too deeply about. But it's just there is an element in the background.
But Cynthia,
Mm.
like as I got to the end, I kind of realized that she's like a woman with like three jobs. What kind of inspired like and
Uh-huh.
maybe that's because she's like an eldest sister,
Mm,
but like what kind of inspired the fact that she like is a NASA engineer,
mm,
is host of this kids TV
mm.
show, and then like her, I don't know where she finds the time to solve this. That's that other
Mm.
side too. Yeah, what inspired Cynthia's three jobs? Her
Yeah.
overwork,
She likes being
hardworking
busy.
Black woman.
Yeah, she just likes being busy, like different things. Like she's a problem solver, so there's different things to kind of solve for different problems. So that's what drew her into like the engineering aspect of it. The Magic Education show, I kind of hint that because she basically taught her younger sisters kind of magic, and so it's out seeing them kind of inspire, and also going through her educational stuff as well. Got into doing the Magic Education show, and the being a detective sleuthing that's in their family thing. So it's basically a character who likes problem solving, likes being busy, and likes getting just doing stuff and doing big things, going on adventures and whatnot. Yeah. Mhm.
Um, so I have a book coming out in August. It
Mhm.
is The Inevitable Undoing of Zahara Douglas, which not a historical, but it takes place in 1999 during the Y2K crisis. It's a fantasy about a young girl who sees her twin sister being hustled into a car with a stranger, and moments later, no one remembers her twin sister even exists, not even their mother.
Mhm.
And so it's yeah, that is the I'm in copy edits, and so that's
Mhm.
kind of top of mind. Work in progress is my Black Witches story, which I'm super excited
Mhm.
about, which I'm still writing. So hopefully that'll come out in the
Mhm.
next year or two.
For me, I'm currently working on the draft, turning it in this month. It hasn't been officially announced yet, but it's a contemporary mystery, cozy mystery thing. It's very fun. It's modern day. There's no magic in it, but it's really fun. It's a plot bunny. I've just been working away at it. So it actually will come out later this year as well. So look for that. and just others, a bunch of different cozy fantasy kind of adventure things that I've been working on finding away. That's really fun stuff that's hoping will find a place and home later at some point. Always writing for different things. Hmm.
Anything else? Cool. All right. Thank you so much.
Can we get one more rousing round of applause for Leslye and Nicole? Thank you so much. I will let y'all step away and go backstage, and I'll give y'all some quick instructions about what is coming next. But thank you so much to everyone here, virtually and in person. So if you are here in person, we're going to take a couple of minutes to reset our space for a signing line. You can help us out greatly if you have a chair just by folding it up and putting it against this wall right here. The signing table will be over this way, and we'll ask you to just line up in this doorway and send the line back that way. If you need to buy any of the books this evening, they are upstairs at the cash register. If your interest is piqued in any of Nicole or Leslie's books coming out, any that are available for pre-order, we can help you with as well. Just ask us at the register. Um, and we thank you so much for being here and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.